Imagine you're a German reconnaissance pilot flying over France in the final months of World War II. Below you, you spot an American armored division preparing for battle, rows of Sherman tanks, artillery pieces, military trucks, engineers setting up camp. Everything points to a major offensive. You report what you've seen. German commanders begin moving troops to meet the expected attack. But there is one problem. None of it is real. The tanks are made of rubber. The artillery is inflatable. Some of the soldiers aren't even trying to fight. They're painters, illustrators, architects, sound engineers, even fashion designers. Their mission wasn't to destroy the German army. It was to convince the Germans they were facing an army that didn't exist. And somehow, it worked. Not once, not twice, but over and over again. For decades, the men behind these missions couldn't tell anyone what they had done. Their unit remained classified, their operations hidden from the public, and their successes known only to a handful of military planners. Today, they're remembered by a name that perfectly captured what they were: the Ghost Army. This is the true story of the small American unit that used deception instead of firepower, and helped save thousands of Allied lives during the final year of World War II. The Ghost Army didn't exist when the United States entered World War II. It was created in early 1944, just months before the Allied invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe. American military planners knew the invasion of France would depend on more than tanks and soldiers. It would depend on convincing Germany to make the wrong decisions instead of simply attacking the enemy. They decided to manipulate what the enemy believed. To do that, the U.S. Army assembled one of the most unusual military units ever created. Officially, it was called the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. The unit consisted of just over 1,000 men, but its mission was to impersonate entire divisions, making the Germans believe they were facing forces 20 or even 30 times larger. The Army looked for people with skills most military units would never consider valuable: artists, illustrators, architects, engineers, advertising specialists, radio technicians, men who understood not only how to build something, but how to create a convincing illusion. Many had studied at art schools before the war. Others had worked in advertising, where making something appear bigger, better, or more important was already part of the job. Now those same talents would become weapons. Every operation followed the same objective: convince German reconnaissance aircraft, German radio operators, and German intelligence officers that an American division was preparing to attack somewhere it wasn't. If the deception worked, German commanders would move tanks, artillery, and thousands of soldiers toward the wrong location. Every enemy unit sent chasing a phantom was one less unit waiting for the real attack. And that's exactly what the Ghost Army intended to create: not a battlefield victory, a battlefield illusion. But fooling experienced German commanders would take much more than a few fake tanks. The illusion had to be convincing from every possible angle. The Ghost Army didn't rely on a single trick. Their deception worked because they attacked every sense the enemy used to gather information. The first step was visual. From the ground, an inflatable tank looked exactly like what it was: a rubber decoy. But German reconnaissance aircraft rarely flew low enough to inspect every vehicle. From thousands of feet above, shape mattered far more than material. The Ghost Army carried hundreds of inflatable vehicles: M4, Sherman tanks, artillery pieces, jeeps, trucks, even aircraft. Most could be unpacked, inflated, and positioned by just a few soldiers in a matter of minutes. Once arranged across roads, fields, and forests, they created the appearance of an entire armored division preparing for battle. The illusion didn't stop with the vehicles. The soldiers left fresh tire tracks in the dirt. They parked trucks where supply vehicles would normally be found. They built tents, set up field kitchens, hung laundry. Every detail suggested that thousands of troops had recently arrived. From the air, experienced reconnaissance pilots saw a growing American military camp. The deception became even more convincing after sunset. Engineers carefully positioned lights throughout the camp to imitate the normal activity of a large army during the night. From a distance, nothing looked unusual, but creating a convincing image was only the beginning. The Ghost Army also had to fool an enemy that wasn't just watching. It was listening. Powerful loudspeaker systems were mounted on military trucks. Before deploying to Europe, engineers recorded hours of authentic military sounds. Sherman tanks changing gears, trucks moving in long convoys, bulldozers at work, bridges being crossed, soldiers building temporary camps. The recordings were carefully edited into realistic sequences that matched the movement of an entire armored division. When night fell, the loudspeakers broadcast those sounds across the countryside. To anyone listening from miles away, it seemed as though hundreds of vehicles were arriving. At the same time, another team was working in complete silence. Specially trained radio operators copied the communication style of real American divisions. Every unit had its own habits, its own procedures, its own rhythm on the radio. The operators studied those patterns until they could reproduce them convincingly. German listening stations intercepted the transmissions. To them, everything appeared normal. The same radio traffic, the same call signs, the same divisions they had been tracking for weeks. Meanwhile, other Ghost Army soldiers traveled through nearby towns wearing the insignia of the divisions they were impersonating. They visited cafes, stopped at local shops, talked openly about imaginary troop movements, knowing word would eventually reach German intelligence. Individually, none of these tricks would have been enough. Together, they created an illusion so convincing that experienced German commanders often accepted it as real. And before long, the Ghost Army would put that illusion to the test on the battlefield. By the summer of 1944, the Ghost Army had finished training. Now their deception would be tested against a real enemy. Unlike most support units, they operated close to the front lines. German artillery, reconnaissance aircraft, patrols, all were constant threats. Their first major missions came as Allied forces broke out of Normandy and advanced rapidly across France. German commanders desperately tried to determine where the next attack would come. The Ghost Army gave them the wrong answer. At carefully chosen locations, the unit assembled fake armored divisions in a matter of hours. While German intelligence focused on those positions, the real Allied forces continued moving elsewhere. Once the deception had served its purpose, everything disappeared. The inflatable vehicles were deflated, the equipment was packed, the trucks rolled out. Within hours, the Ghost Army was on the road to its next assignment. Then, the process began again. Over the following months, the unit supported Allied operations across France and Luxembourg. Each mission was different. Each required the deception to match the tactical situation. Sometimes the objective was to suggest an attack. Other times, it was to hide a withdrawal or protect the movement of real troops. By the end of 1944, the Ghost Army had proven that deception could become a weapon of its own. Its greatest operation, however, had not yet begun. By early 1945, the war in Western Europe was entering its final stage. Germany had been pushed back across France and Belgium. Only one major natural barrier remained: the Rhine River. Crossing it would open the road into the heart of Germany. German commanders knew it, and the Allies knew it. Both sides understood that one of the war's decisive battles was approaching. The question wasn't whether the Allies would cross the Rhine, it was where. The Ghost Army was given one of its most important assignments. During an operation later known as Operation Fierson, the unit was ordered to convince the Germans that a major river crossing would take place several miles away from the real attack. The deception was enormous. Inflatable tanks appeared along the river. Artillery positions were assembled. Hundreds of dummy vehicles filled the countryside. Radio operators generated the traffic expected from a large combat force preparing for an assault. At night, sound trucks broadcast recordings of heavy vehicles moving toward the river. While German commanders focused their attention on the false crossing site, Allied forces prepared the real operation elsewhere. German units committed resources toward the wrong sector, reducing the pressure on the actual crossing. It wasn't the Ghost Army alone that made the crossing successful. Thousands of Allied soldiers, engineers, artillery crews, and airmen all played critical roles. But the Ghost Army helped shape the battlefield before the first assault boats entered the water. By the spring of 1945, Germany's military position was collapsing. Cities fell one after another. The Allied advance accelerated. Soon, the war in Europe was over. The Ghost Army quietly disappeared. There were no victory parades celebrating inflatable tanks. No newspaper headlines praising fake radio operators. Most of the men simply returned home. Their work remained classified. For decades, they rarely spoke about what they had done. Many couldn't. Friends and even family members had little idea how unusual their wartime service had been. Only years later, after government records were gradually declassified, did historians begin to assemble the full story. The public discovered that one of America's most successful military units had relied not on overwhelming firepower, but on creativity. The Ghost Army carried out more than 20 deception operations during the final year of the war. Military historians believe those operations diverted German forces, protected Allied units, and helped save thousands of lives. Exactly how many can never be known. Today, the Ghost Army stands as one of the most remarkable examples of military deception in modern history, because it proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon on a battlefield isn't a tank or an artillery gun. It's the ability to convince your enemy that reality is something it isn't. For years, the men of the Ghost Army fought a war that officially never happened, and in doing so, they helped win the one that did. This was a real tale from history.